neuroscience of addiction in general. And then since we're the BMAT group, I'm going to present specifically on what opioids do to the brain, and then some conclusions, a bit about some thoughts about why this is also important to consider when treating addiction. All right. So we've been able to map the human genome for a while now. And the hope with the mapping of the human genome was that we were going to be able to like pinpoint all these specific genes that were going to tell us exactly why people did certain things, and then we could change them. And while we've been able to identify genes, we know what they all are more or less now, we've pretty much concluded there's no set genes for addiction. It's a lot more complicated than just being like it's this gene or this combination of genes. There's likely at least some genetic foundation for personality in general, and some variations in personality styles are based on genetics, but in combination with environmental factors. And so the genetics of personality plus the environmental influence seems to create a susceptibility for certain psychiatric conditions. So conditions like anxiety, antisocial personality disorder, depression, and then those in turn seem to relate to a heightened risk for substance use disorder. So example would be genes related to the monoamine oxidases influence the monoaminergic balance of the brain, and those that kind of have low activity alleles in these regions, who also experience maltreatment as children, those persons are more likely to go on and develop antisocial personality disorder and increased substance use as results. So it's a pretty complicated little cluster of a bunch of things lining up, that's not purely speaking to genes. Another example is polymorphisms on the nicotinic acetylcholine receptor system have been found to influence attention and sensory processing, and those seem to relate to subsequent use of nicotine and other substance use disorders. A hiccup here, or an additional complication, is that these are really significantly influenced by environment, and they appear really early in development. So they found that maternal smoking during pregnancy really significantly upregulates these receptors, and that later in turn leads to behavioral disorders, including substance use disorders. So it's not a pure just the presence of this of the genes that are influencing these specific receptors, but also that largely important environmental influence that has to be kind of turning these things on in a certain direction to increase the development of risk. So we do know, we've been able to kind of more clearly identify genetic variation as it relates to the dopamine system. And there's very strong evidence that the reason why drugs are as rewarding as they are is because they increase dopamine, particularly the increase of dopamine that happens in the nucleus accumbens. So this is a little clip art that shows the important parts of the reward pathway in the brain. So there's the ventral tegmental area, the nucleus accumbens, and then the prefrontal cortex. And the ventral tegmental area is going to connect to both the nucleus accumbens and the prefrontal cortex and kind of create this reward pathway structure. So in this clip art, we got red to green to blue. It's kind of this pathway that emerges. And this pathway is specifically activated by rewarding stimulus, such as drugs. But what dopamine actually does is it actually encodes the prediction of the reward. And that's why it increases pleasure, is it's encoding that prediction of future reward. And it makes the reinforcers rewarding through that process. It creates learning about what's pleasurable in these subcortical and cortical regions. So I mentioned this specifically, like why this prediction of reward, this learning of reward is so important, is because I also study behavioral addictions. And this is kind of one of those linchpins of why gambling or video gaming can be just as addictive as, say, heroin, because it's not the literal like dopamine that's being turned on by having this drug in your body that's creating that activation of the reward pathway. It's what's happening is it's being activated based on the prediction of the reward. So just knowing that reward is coming is what gets that reward pathway spring into action. It's not that there's literally being like into the brain drug. We've also found glutamate, GABA, cannabinoids, serotonin have also been linked to reward processing, and those are important at the molecular level. So I'd be remiss not to give a quick mention about cortical immaturity. So the parts of the brain related to this reward processing and impulsivity are among the last to mature. And it's not until an individual is approximately 25, particularly males, age 25, when this kind of part of the brain is like, and this increased risk up until age 25 concerning because they're likely doing a cluster of high-risk behaviors. So this is some little screenshots from a video that I always show when I teach this topic to my students. And I'm not going to show it. I'm not going to like bounce us out to this here. Here, and what happens in this video is we've got this little kiwi bird, and he trots along, and he finds this little drop of like a little yellow nectar thing, and he checks it out and he drinks it up. And his first taste, he's like, Yahoo, and he floats away and he's really bright and happy. So that's his picture of him being all happy from drinking his nectar. But as the video progresses, he keeps drinking his little nuggets, but now when he drinks, things get bright for a moment, but then he starts coming down, and as he comes down, things get really dark, and he starts crashing to the ground after he gets his little uplifts of excitement. And by the end of the video, this poor little guy he's pretty much permanently walking around all beat up and gloomy. The screen color changes, everything is dark and gray. He physically is just shuffling along, and he's trying to just pull himself towards that next nugget so that things don't get any worse than they already were at the moment that he doesn't have it. And while what I really like about this video is it's about 5 minutes long, and with no words, you're able to kind of deliver this really impactful message of how, while an addict starts out using, because they're getting high is really great and so fun, and it allows them to, escape whatever they're trying to escape. By the time we're usually seeing them in a treatment setting, the drugs often lost that reward process for them. It's not rewarding at all. Everything in their life has become about just avoiding the pain of not using and trying to keep things from getting any worse than how bad they already are. Why that happens is what's happening in our brain. So what's happening with the kiwi bird is directly a brain-related process. So when your brain isn't used to a drug, you get this huge kind of surge and initial response. And this is historically, this is kind of a foundational paper by Solomon Corbett. They labeled this the A process. So the A process is kind of that high action. Your brain gets this really big uptake of whatever's going on, so dopamine in the case of drugs. But immediately the brain enacts an opponent process to try to crash that down, cut down that A process. And the cut down correction process is called the B process. And what this process is referred to as is allostasis. And this is how the body and the brain reacts to stressors in order to regain homeostasis. So back like Bio 101, bodies like to be in homeostasis. We try to keep ourselves there as possible. We don't do well with fluctuations in temperature. We don't do well with fluctuations in dopamine. So over extended brain use, extended use of drugs, for example, the reward system or the brain system, the reward process within the brain shifts to adapt the continuous overstimulation. The brain basically gets really, really good at creating that opponent process. And what happens during this time is the drugs shift from being strongly wanted to strongly needed. If you recall back to the earlier slides about how the how dopamine reacts, that dopamine is just reacting to cues, not the actual drug being within your system. And a lot of the reason why the brain is able to get so good at knocking down the A process is because it actually kicks in that B process before the person's even ingested the drug. Just seeing the cues of drug use allows the brain to like be like, oh, I know it's coming, and start to knock down that A process with a strong B process. So our brains basically habituate to getting better and better to blocking the high. So opioids work in the brain specifically by mimicking endorphins, which are endogenous morphine-like substances, which within the brain act as a natural painkiller. So think back to when humans were walking around with saber-toothed tigers. So you get attacked by the saber-toothed tiger. What would happen is the endorphins would kick in and they'd provide you enough pain relief so that you could ignore the fact that your leg just got nearly bitten off, and you can run back to your friends and they come and they help you kill the tiger, and then they help carry you home so you can rest and heal. Without those endorphins, the second his teeth like hit up into your leg, you'd just be in so much pain, you just lay there frozen and he'd eat you up, which is not good for survival of the human race. So that's the A process at work. In some ways, that's the endorphins naturally reacting. But if you recall the B process from the previous slide, our brain has a really strong B process for endorphins. Again, this is thinking from an evolutionary standpoint, is very important. So say that saber-toothed tiger, he just like nibbled you a little bit. So you're dripping some blood, you're gonna bleed out eventually. But you're feeling so good from the endorphins from having been bitten. And then maybe you got really excited and you turned around and you killed him. You don't even notice that you got bitten. Well, before long, you're gonna bleed out and you're gonna die. Again, not good for survival of the human race. So our brain created a really fine-tuned system to flood us with endorphins so we can get to safety, but then quickly counteract those endorphins so that as soon as we see the cues for safety, maybe our village, our friends, we are able to know that we're really badly hurt and get help and get stitched up or whatever they were doing then. And they've done studies, they've looked at normal lifespans of persons who have like deficits related to some senses, so people who are blind, deaf, anosmic, and they all have normal lifespans. But for individuals who can't feel pain because of congenital insensitivity, those persons almost always die young from injury. It's those B processes knocking down the endorphins when we're hurt is incredibly essential to our survival. And unfortunately, that same thing that is so important for our survival makes long-term drug use particularly punishing. So there's natural anti-opiate peptides within our brain, specifically when you're using opioids. And there's a range of them that have been identified. So dynorphin is one. It's almost like a natural kind of like Narcan that our brain has to help keep the opioids from creating too much impact. And those anti-opiates kind of rush in to create the allostasis. These also contribute to tolerance, physiological withdrawal as well. And whereas some other drugs, repetitive use leads to a decrease in the number of receptors that are available, this doesn't happen with opioids. What happens instead is the signaling is what's compromised. So the receptors kind of basically become less effective, not that there's fewer of them that exist. So there's as many receptors around, and what happens is the drugs are basically regularly flooding the brain with like euphoria. So to get to allostasis, the anti-opiates actually create pain as that kind of opponent process. And again, think back to that dopamine reward pathway. It's not just the active drug, but also the cues that can start the anti-opioids into action, creating that B process. So the context that an individual is in can actually heighten the withdrawal symptoms. And so the cues are particularly important. So there was the original studies that kind of we probably learned in maybe even high school about addiction models was they put a little rat in a cage, they give him a little lever, and that lever, every time he hits it, he gets some heroin. And what happens with these rats is they pretty quickly get really good at giving themselves lots and lots of heroin, and then they overdose and die. What they don't tell us about it as much as early in school is that they did later experiments where they gave the rat the heroin lever again, but they put him in what they called like a rat park cage, where he's hanging out with a bunch of other rats. He's got food, he's got exercise, he can hang out and play with all these other rats. And in these experiments, very, very little heroin was used. No rats went on to use compulsively, and no rats overdosed and died. And this experiment was repeated in essence with human subjects during the Vietnam War. So when the troops were in Southeast Asia, about 20% of them were using opioids. And what they decided to do was they decided to detox those who tested positive for opioids before allowing them to fly home. And what they found was only about 5% of those who had been addicted relapsed upon return. So by removing people from the context with the cues of use, so you're no longer around the stress, you're no longer around the gunfire, maybe the jungle cues, but then returning them home to cues of safety and support. So their loved ones, their quiet neighborhoods, their 9-to-5 jobs, the anti-opioids that would have triggered cravings and withdrawals, they weren't cued. And people were much more successful with recovery. And then tolerance is also important to consider within this. So to cope with the B process, the anti-opioids that require users to take increasingly large doses of the drugs, or maybe move on to a more potent form of the drug, such as fentanyl. And then in turn, the brain just keeps adapting and keeps exerting a more powerful B system. So heavy users can actually end up needing about 150 times the dose of non-users just to feel right. And that doesn't even get them high anymore. So flashing back to the bird, it becomes all about avoiding withdrawal, pain, insomnia, GI upset, and whatnot. So this is why buprenorphine can be such an effective and powerful intervention, because it gives you enough A to prevent withdrawal, but it gives enough B so that the brain doesn't need to exert its own B process and create tolerance, and because you're kind of able to kind of put the person with the correct dosing into that sweet spot, you also create that potential for tapering, can kind of bring the brain back down to normal. Additionally, if you're working with someone that's kind of within their own environment, ideally also undergoing psychotherapy, working with a therapist to identify, people, places, things that relate to their addiction, they get to relearn the cues for use, what things that used to trigger them to use, with their brain sort of held stable. So they're not able to launch into that withdrawal process just seeing the cues. So seeing the place they used to use, the friends they used to use with doesn't immediately create a broad brain response because the buprenorphine is holding them kind of even keeled. And then they're able to kind of build self-efficacy and really relearn that these things don't always equal use, and they're able to more successfully go about their lives without active addiction. So some citations I have. So the book I'm including, so this is Never Enough, and this is a really interesting kind of accessible book on neuroscience of addiction. It was written by a former addict who went on to become a neuroscientist because she really wanted to learn about why she had decided to do the things that she did. And then she wrote a book about it. So I definitely recommend that one. That's all I've got. Thanks.
Beautiful. Thank you, Meredith. That was jam-packed with all kinds of really interesting information. In some ways, I hadn't really thought about the neuroscience before, and I wrote down the name of the book and the author. I may be getting that one when I'm shopping on Amazon next. Sounds kind of interesting. Any questions or comments quickly for Meredith before we go to our case? Just as a reminder, that PowerPoint is available on our resources section on the webpage. So if you go to ETSU BMAT, just Google it. You scroll down on the page, there's a resources hyperlink, and the PowerPoint will be there. So in case you missed the book that she was referencing at the end, you can find it at the end of that PowerPoint, or just reviewing those slides. I think I will be again, because that was a load of useful information, Meredith.